Oh, I just saw a fox go down the road. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this screencast of me going to go through family dysfunction and psychological explanations for schizophrenia. I will apologise if Bella turns up because she's being annoying as shit this evening and won't shut up for something. Shut up! Um, so, psychological explanations for schizophrenia. Big bullet point. There's quite a lot to do on this, so let's make a start, shall we? First thing we're going to be looking at is psychological explanations for, as in family dysfunction, basically. So how you, and this is essentially how both your environment and your family can actually cause you to have schizophrenia. So there's quite a lot here. This is what we are talking about. We're looking at family dysfunction, cognitive explanations, which include dysfunctional thought processing, though it's pretty much the same thing. But the first thing we're going to look at is family dysfunction. Now, I know that a lot of my students believe they have dysfunctional families, and in some cases, they are correct. Now, just because, by the way, because I remember coming from my own dysfunctional family and thinking, oh shit, I'm going to get schizophrenia. But just because you do have a dysfunctional family does not mean that you are necessarily going to get schizophrenia. You kind of need to have a biological predisposition for it, but more on that later. So we need to understand what is actually meant by family dysfunction. Every family is dysfunctional in some way or another, but we're talking pretty high levels. So the families that do not have beneficial relationships are constant source of influence, a constant source of stress, are thought to influence the onset of schizophrenia. So there's three main factors, and these three have to be talked about in your A01. High levels of interpersonal conflict. So essentially, there's a high degree of families arguing in the relationship. So it's relatively normal for families to argue. It's relatively normal for families to argue, but we're talking excessive amounts of arguing. So, um, uh, you know, tension in the air, so on and so forth. There's poor communication. There's poor there's poor communication or difficulty in communication. So, for example, if families keep secrets quite a lot and there's a lot of tension and using those secrets and a lot of distrust, maybe there's quite a lot that falls under this. Sorry, I think Bella might be trying to have a poo in one of my boxes. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, got distracted by cat poo. Um, uh, yeah, so poor communication. So essentially, that means, like I said, low levels of communication, a difficulty to talk to people. Some of my students, their best friends are their mums, for example, and so they have good communication. So we're talking about families that don't have that dynamic where you kind of hate each other a little bit. But also the third characteristic is parents being overly critical and controlling of their children. Now, these three you would argue, is not a healthy dynamic. It's not a dynamic in which is going to produce healthy children necessarily, and actually is thought to contribute now to schizophrenia. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to digest. Now, the other thing to note down here is what's called a double bind. Now, double bind is part of the family dysfunction explanation, and it's linked to this idea about putting kids into a double bind, which is quite a confusing and contradictory situation. So, for example, telling one parent telling the kid to like that they're, I don't know, they're doing well in school, but the other parent kind of saying, oh no, but you're doing pretty crap at school. And that's confusing for a child, for example. One being overly nice and one being overly generous. It can be something as simple as you having to look after your parents. That is a double bind. That's a confusing and contradictory situation. So, for example, a type of double bind situation is if one or both parents have addictions or compulsions. That can have strong influences on family members. One or both parents exploit the children and treat them as a possession rather than their child, for example. One or both parents being unable to provide basic physical care for their children. So a double bind is a situation in which the kid will find itself confused, unable to comprehend what's happening, maybe frustrated and irritated by lack of guidance in some senses. But double bind is part of the functional family dysfunction. Sorry, and a key thing about double bind is it creates what's called learned helplessness. This is one of the things you would want to talk about here. Learned helplessness is when we essentially teach someone to be helpless. It's when we teach somebody to how do I put this? Learned helplessness is when people feel they've been put into lose-lose situations and basically feel like no matter what they do, it's not going to get them out. So it's a key part of depression, by the way, and it may actually explain the link between depression and schizophrenia. Basically, double bind is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You can't help but annoy one parent, for example. So double bind is a factor. Now, one thing you do have to understand is the consequence of family dysfunction and double bind. It basically means the kid is going to have what's called flattened affect in adulthood. Flattened affect is when you don't respond to things in the right emotional way. So you tend to be flat in your emotions. You tend to have no emotions. I have quite bad flat affect, basically. I'm not really an emotional person, for example. And so I maybe respond to things less emotionally than what people expect. Now, I'm not saying I have schizophrenia, but flattened affect is quite important. The other key thing I do want to point out here, because this is quite important, is that we're talking about in adulthood. Schizophrenia only really comes about in adulthood. And that's a really key thing to know, by the way, because some questions may try catch you out and may get you to try diagnose kids as schizophrenic, for example. But that's what it says here. Children generally do not get schizophrenia. It does happen, though it's very rare. And it's crucial that you link the experiences that children have growing up with the emergence of schizophrenia later on as an adolescent or a adult or full-grown adult. So we need to evaluate the family dysfunction explanation, right? There is research support. Have a look in your workbooks for this and other resources, but there is research support, therefore it's valid or credible, right? It's useful, for example, a different evaluation point is useful because from that we can create, from this idea of family dysfunction, we can create this idea of family therapy. So if your family is dysfunctional, well, shit, let's create a therapy that actually addresses that dysfunction. And family therapy, which is what we're going to look at in a couple of weeks' time, family therapy is a way round that. Basically, it is a useful way. And family therapy has been shown to be successful. So is it a chance that it therefore gives the theory credibility because the practical application that came as a result of that theory is actually quite credible? Well, not necessarily, and this is something you do need to be aware of. This is, I think we can agree, one of the sexiest terms in psychology. There may be an aetiological fallacy here. An aetiological fallacy is where we give credit to a theory because the thing that theory reproduced is then successful. But that's a mistaken way of thinking. Now, if you can understand aetiological fallacy, it's a great point to use. What a fallacy is a mistaken way of thinking, and it is a mistake to give the theory credit just because the practical application that came from it was successful. For example, let me give you the example I tend to tell my students. Another good aetiological fallacy is this: imagine I scream in your face. You've really pissed me off. You've maybe done poor in a mock exam or something, and you've just not really cared. Imagine I scream in your face, so much so that I give you a headache. That headache is coming from an environmental point of view. In this case, me screaming at you. If I feel bad and I give you a paracetamol, which is a biological treatment, that paracetamol will fix your headache. But just because the biological treatment worked clearly does not mean that the headache came biologically in the first place. So you may have to watch that a few times to wrap your head around it, but aetiological fallacy is a really, really good point to be able to use. But one other issue is that there's an issue of cause and effect. So essentially, did the dysfunction in the family cause schizophrenia, like the theory says, or is it logical to say, imagine you're sitting around the table with your family, your nice, functional, working family, and then you start having hallucinations or delusions or believing that you're God or Moses or Buddha, for example, however many other religious figures are out there. But imagine you start thinking you're one of them. Do you really think that your family are going to be okay with that? Is there a chance that your delusions are going to make your mum and dad start arguing, for example? Right, and your dad's like, "Oh, just let him be." Right, if he thinks he's Moses, just let him be Moses. Right, whereas your mum's like, "No, we're not doing that. Right, you're not going off to Egypt to part the Red Sea. No, you're not. You're sitting here and you're eating your broccoli." So, what causes what essentially? Now, there are other dysfunctional theories, and I do want to get through these quite quickly. The first one is the schizophrenic mother. Sometimes I wonder, these are paid models, paid actors? What weird photo shoot was this from? Anyway, Schizophrenic Mother is, please note this down because it's important, it's a historical theory, meaning that nobody actually really believes in it anymore, because it's kind of been disproven, but we kind of have to teach it for some weird reason. Now, the Schizophrenic Mother is basically also known as the refrigerator mother. I'll say that again, also known as the refrigerator mother. And it was a major theory in the 40s and 50s, whereby basically a link was made between your mother being cold and distant and you getting schizophrenia. Hence, the cold and distant, by the way, hence the refrigerator, because they're always cold and apparently distant. So mothers were actually blamed for their child's disorder. They are still quite blamed for autism, which is quite bad in my opinion, because it's. I personally believe it's clearly not the mother's fault at all. But it's ridiculous. So honestly, the papers go ridiculous with this. It's stupid. But it's a really both of these, the schizophrenia version and the autism version, is, I think, incredibly offensive, incredibly socially sensitive. But basically, it's no longer really regarded. Now, you can only maybe squeeze 1 or 2 points out of this, max 1 or 2 points. The other one is the expressed emotion theory. So the expressed emotion theory is, I think, quite important. It's basically, and I'll just slow this down. Expressed emotion deals with the emotional responses that parents have to a deteriorating situation in which someone is slowly getting schizophrenia. So, I don't know if that is this. So, very much the same thing. The theory outlines how the family's reaction to someone's deteriorating mental health can actually have a huge impact on the prognosis of the client. So this happens with depression quite a lot. It also is seen in schizophrenia. So family members or families with what is called high expressed emotion. So you get some families that are high in expressed emotion, and they're hostile, they're critical, and most importantly, they have an incredibly low tolerance for the patient. So basically what happens is you start thinking you're Moses or Jesus or some Christ or God-like figure, and your family's tolerance will get lower and lower and lower, to the point where all you need to go is, or you need to say, you just need to say one thing at the table, and all of a sudden your family are just up there, just I can't do it anymore. Look, why does he keep talking about the bloody Red Sea? And basically, a parent will and a family will have incredibly low tolerance. So they not only criticize behaviors, but they also criticize the actual person. And this actually is quite more likely going to cause a relapse. Now, the key fact you need to know here is sufferers are 4 times more likely to relapse when they go back into a high expressed emotion family rather than a low expressed emotion family. So it's a very, very good explanation for relapsing schizophrenia. But it's essentially how your family react. So the family is essentially hostile, which makes it a lot worse. So Linzen is the person who come up with this idea about 4 times. You have that there. And there was also a Iranian study here by Torobi et al. I'm just going to get rid of this space because it's going to wind me up. But Torobi et al. In 1996 looked at, let's have a look, the high prevalence of expressed emotion in Iranian culture. So overprotective mothers and rejecting fathers. These are 2 massive, massive factors that come up in Iranian culture quite a lot. So it's this idea about how culture can influence schizophrenia, and the negative emotional climate in these families seem to overwhelm kind of coping strategies. So high expressed emotion is a very good explanation about how people keep schizophrenia, not necessarily what causes schizophrenia, but it's a very, very good explanation for what maintains schizophrenia. And that's actually a relatively important point. Now, a bit of evidence here. There is Berger 1965, so they looked at double bind statements, right? So again, you're going to need that. You're also going to need to know a little bit about practical applications, which we've kind of covered already. So again, high expressed emotion, or the expressed emotion theory, family therapy would actually be very good to get past that. You teach people to be more tolerant. I had a student a couple of years ago. This isn't with schizophrenia, it's with depression. I had a student a couple of years ago who was very, very depressed, very depressed. And one of the things I used to say to her is, if you're really struggling, just go out, go for a walk, just clear your head. She kind of altered my advice a little bit and went on a drive when she was feeling really depressed. And her family, who were at their wits' end with the depression, their tolerance had come down, 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 down. They weren't understanding. They weren't respectful of the student. They weren't offering support. They panicked that my student had gone out for a drive, and they thought she'd gone off to kill herself. The police found her. She was fine. She was just getting some air. The police found her, brought her back to the family, and the first thing the mum said was, "How could you do this to me?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you're okay." Not, "Give her a hug." The first thing she said was, because her tolerance had been worn down so much, because she wasn't a particularly supportive person, the first thing that the mother said was, "How could you do this to me?" And I remember saying to the student at the time, "Look, your mum's trying to react in the right way, but that's not a good way to react." And that's high expressed emotion. We can teach that family to improve their tolerance, to reduce their hostility. That's family dysfunction. Okay, so couple of other weaknesses here as well. I've written a bit of detail here, so you probably do want to pause and make sure you've got the elaboration. Don't just go to the point. Look at the elaboration as well. Don't know why this is doing this. This is really annoying. And then there is another one. Oh, bloody hell! This is slowing down. There is another evaluation just there. A bit of further contradictory evidence. So Liam, spelled differently, measured patterns of parental communications with schizophrenic child and found no differences with normal families, neurotypical families, if you will. So there is refuting evidence to double bind. Now, if you're asked to talk about theories or evaluate theories in family dysfunction, these are the 4 that you can talk about. So there's generally quite a lot here. There's a lot of scope for you to be able to talk about this. The other thing that may come up is cognitive theories, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. I'm going to get you to have to do some research on this. But when we're talking about cognitive theories of schizophrenia, we're talking about how people's thought processes can become maladaptive. That's a great term. So maladaptive, essentially, they no longer fit They're no longer working in society, basically. Maladaptive means bad workings. So this is the idea that faulty thought processes are responsible for the onset and the maintenance, not only getting schizophrenia, but maintaining schizophrenia. And Beck and Rector went on to develop quite a holistic theory that kind of linked everything all together, right? Now, delusions are a big part of this bad processing. People that believe that they are God, people believe that they are being persecuted by the FBI, they've got faulty thinking. And that leads to faulty behaviors, for example. Putting a colander on your head, strapping it on and saying, the government can't get me now. Don't focus on the behavior. Focus on their thinking here. Clearly, their thinking has gone wrong. In order to fix the faulty behavior, putting a colander on your head, you need to fix the faulty thinking that precedes that. There's two things you need to know about just the general cognitive theories: cognitive biases and cognitive deficits. Why is my thing doing this? This is really winding me up. So, first things first, cognitive deficits are impairments in thought processing, such as memory, right? Cognitive biases are present when people notice, pay attention to, or remember certain types of information better than others. For example, cognitive biases are a little bit like selective attention. You know, like if you're telling someone, oh, it's raining outside. I've just put Bella outside. If you're telling someone who has anorexia that they are a normal weight, like you're a doctor, they won't pay attention to that. But if someone says, oh, you know, you're looking, I don't know, you're looking like you put on weight, in like an encouraging way, they'll selectively pay attention to that and think, well, no, I need to then lose this weight, clearly, don't I? So, but cognitive biases are you selectively pay attention to certain things which keep you in the episode. So people with depression hugely have selective attention. They will only listen and pay attention to things that keep them in their depressive state. So why are you doing this? Anyway, let's have a look at some cognitive deficits, right? So there is evidence, as it says, that people diagnosed with schizophrenia have difficulties in processing some types of information. So, for example, their attention skills are massively reduced. They appear easily distracted, a little bit like ADHD children, for example. A number of researchers have suggested that difficulties in understanding other people's behavior might explain some of the behavior. So social behavior depends in part on using other people's actions as clues, but some people have been diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to have difficulties. Do you realize how difficult face-to-face communication is? I mean, it's incredible. Like, not only are you listening to their words, but you're also reading their non-verbal behavior as well, and you know their hand gestures. When you're talking to someone, as you are listening to me, you're listening to everything, not just their voice. Now, people with schizophrenia appear to develop some problems with that. So, well, we don't know why, but basically it is a cognitive deficit. It's a cognitive lack of skill, if you will. Why are you doing this? I have no idea. Cognitive biases, on the other hand, refer to, as I said, things like selective attention. So the idea of cognitive biases has been used mainly for these two: delusions and auditory hallucinations. So again, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is what I would particularly focus on: is these are the two symptoms where we have cognitive biases. Lastly, before we go into this next little bit, one theory that has been put forward, and I find this really interesting actually, is that all of us, or most of us, experience a voice in our head. And that's normal, by the way. As in, like, it's like your mind's voice. It's not like a voice outside that sounds like you can hear it. It's a mind's voice. So I'm just in my head screaming the words apple and chicken right now. Right? I can hear that. People with schizophrenia are thought to misprocess that voice and they hear it as a hallucination, not their mind's voice, if you will. Now, some of you don't understand what I'm talking about because some people can't actually hear a voice in their head. Some people have pictures in their head. Well, when I ask you to think about something, some people just picture it in pictures. Some people hear it. Some people hear it in words. Some people see it as words. Most people see it as all three of them. So I see it as, in my head, I can see pictures. So I'm picturing an apple right now. It's a red one. Now it's a green one. I can see the word apple in my head. It's kind of at a slightly tilted font. And I can hear the word apple. I heard it 3 times then. Some people misperceive that thinking in their head as somebody actually talking to them. So that is another cognitive theory that you hear. Some evaluations just here. Don't want to go into these in too much detail, but you do need to know them. And there's some evaluations here. I would avoid saying, by the way, that cognitive theories are reductionist. They are not reductionist. Please ignore that point, but they are slightly holistic. Okay, one final thing. This is just a tiny add-on to the cognitive theories. Tiny add-on. We know this whole thing about input, process, output. We've looked at this a little bit already. Where was it? Meta representations. So this is just a tiny add-on. One problem that's seen in people with schizophrenia, they start to fail to monitor their own thoughts. You spend every waking day, every day, with your thoughts. So you spend a long time with them. So basically, people, hard to explain, but people with schizophrenia lose the ability to track their thoughts. So one day they're here, next day they're down here, and they don't recognize there's actually that much of a difference. So people with this, oh my God, what is wrong with me today? It's been a long day. Metacognitions are how people monitor their thought processes, but people with schizophrenia are thought to have dysfunction with their thought processes. Sufferers disrupt their own ability to recognize whether a behavior is carried out by ourselves or others. So hallucination, as I say, is actually interpreted as someone else speaking to us, but it's actually your own thoughts. And this is a part of what we call central control. So this is this dysfunctional thought a little bit. So you need to be able to differentiate between cognitive biases and cognitive deficits and dysfunctional thought processes. So there's a slight difference here. Central control is the cognitive ability to suppress automatic thoughts. Some of you may have had intrusive thoughts before. So intrusive thoughts are not hallucinations. They are when it feels like somebody hijacks your own thoughts and makes you think horrible things. In that case, you've lost what's called central control. With hallucinations and delusions, you also lose central control. So disorganized speech, thinking could result from the inability to suppress automatic thoughts, a little bit like someone with Tourette's. So, for example, sufferers of schizophrenia tend to experience derailment of thoughts and spoken sentences because every word they say triggers off other words in their head, and then they start thinking about that, but they're also kind of talking, and they kind of get distracted, and it comes out like, well, so because you're spending half your time up here just getting distracted by everything. So essentially they have a mini voice in their head associating to every word they say, hence the reason they cannot talk to use fully fluent sentences. One thing teachers often do is they're going to get one of you at the front of the class and they'll get 2 people to talk into each ear, and you'll quickly realize how difficult it is if you've got voices in your head, how difficult it is to actually talk sentences. It's markedly much more difficult. So a few evaluations here. Again, I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but again, you're going to need to know these. You should be able to evaluate, elaborate, structure, and give evidence for all 4 of those, but make sure you have them in your pack. And here's a model answer about the cognitive approach in general. It probably is a good idea to make sure you have got that. Questions just here. Outline. Look at this bottom one. Outline and evaluate one or more psychological explanations for schizophrenia. Uh, big point. Big point. So A01 equals 6. You'd have to talk about eight separate things that we have covered. So maybe four on, oh, for God's sake, maybe four on family dysfunction and four on cognitive explanations, including dysfunctional thought processing. But this is a tough bullet point, right? Mainly the thought processing, the cognitive one. So it may take you a watch or two to wrap your head around it. There's a lot of new terms: central control, dysfunctional thought processing, meta representations, cognitive dissonance, cognitive biases. You're going to need to know it all. Hope that was useful.